What if Einstein's most revolutionary ideas were deliberately hidden from the public? Recently declassified documents reveal startling truth. Einstein participated in top-secret dialogues where he developed a scientific framework for reincarnation. Using quantum mechanics, energy conservation, and higher dimensional mathematics, Einstein challenged both religious dogma and scientific materialism with a theory so controversial it was classified for 8 decades. This isn't mysticism, it's how history's greatest physicist scientifically approached consciousness surviving death. The government kept these conversations hidden until now. The classified Princeton Dialogues, Einstein's secret roundtable on consciousness. In the winter of 1947, while the world was still recovering from the devastation of World War II and entering the uncertain terrain of the Cold War, a series of extraordinary meetings took place behind closed doors at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study. These gatherings, comprising Albert Einstein, several quantum physicists, Eastern philosophers, and 2 government observers, remained classified under national security protocols for 8 decades, only recently declassified through Freedom of Information Act requests. These transcripts reveal Einstein engaging with ideas far beyond his public scientific persona, exploring the nature of consciousness, reincarnation, and the fundamental structure of reality in ways that would have shocked the scientific establishment of his time. The meetings originated when Einstein received correspondence from Sri Aurobindo, the Indian philosopher whose integration of Eastern mystical traditions with Western scientific thinking had captured Einstein's attention. There is no reason why the insights of ancient traditions should be dismissed merely because they weren't derived through our current scientific methodology, Einstein noted in the opening session. Throughout history, intuition has often preceded empirical verification. By centuries, this openness to non-Western perspectives characterized these classified dialogues, where Einstein could speak freely without concern for his scientific reputation or political misinterpretations of his views. Government interest in these meetings stemmed partially from the emerging Cold War context, with officials concerned about philosophical implications that might undermine materialist scientific paradigms. Einstein himself was already viewed with suspicion for his pacifist leanings and opposition to nuclear weapons development. I find it ironic that discussions about the nature of consciousness are considered matters of national security, Einstein remarked to J. Robert Oppenheimer, who attended several sessions. Perhaps this indicates we're approaching something fundamental about reality that has implications beyond our current scientific frameworks. The dialogues focused particularly on the relationship between consciousness and the physical universe, with Einstein questioning whether consciousness could be fully explained as merely an emergent property of brain function. The problem of consciousness remains scientific in nature, Einstein insisted during a particularly heated exchange. But our current scientific methods may be insufficient to fully address it. Einstein's willingness to consider that consciousness might have properties not entirely reducible to physical processes represented a significant departure from the behaviorist and materialist paradigms dominating mid-20th century science. Participants in these classified meetings included not only physicists like Oppenheimer and David Bohm, but also philosophers Martin Buber and Jiddu Krishnamurti, creating an unusual interdisciplinary forum. The most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious, Einstein told the gathered thinkers. It is the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of true art and true science. Whoever does not know it and can no longer wonder, no longer marvel, is as good as dead. This appreciation for mystery informed the entire series of dialogues, which approached consciousness not as a problem to be solved through reductionist methods, but as a fundamental aspect of reality requiring new modes of scientific inquiry. The classification of these meetings prevented Einstein's perspectives on consciousness from becoming part of his public legacy for decades. As he noted in the final session, "I suspect future generations may find these discussions more significant than much of my published work on physics. The nature of consciousness may ultimately prove more fundamental to understanding reality than the behavior of light or the structure of the atom." These recently declassified transcripts now allow us to appreciate Einstein's full intellectual legacy, including his serious engagement with questions of consciousness that transcended the materialist paradigms of his era. Einstein's quantum perspective on consciousness continuity. While Albert Einstein is widely known for his skepticism about quantum mechanics, famously declaring that God does not play dice with the universe, the classified Princeton dialogues reveal a much more nuanced engagement with quantum theory's implications for consciousness. In these private conversations, Einstein explored how quantum principles might suggest mechanisms for consciousness to persist beyond physical death, potentially in ways compatible with reincarnation concepts found in various philosophical traditions. The quantum measurement problem represents the most profound challenge to our understanding of physical reality, Einstein stated during the third session. If consciousness somehow collapses quantum superpositions, we must consider the possibility that consciousness operates according to principles not entirely contained within our current physical models. Einstein was particularly intrigued by the observer effect in quantum mechanics, the apparent role of consciousness in determining physical outcomes through observation. While publicly critical of the Copenhagen interpretation's probabilistic approach, these classified transcripts show Einstein privately considering whether quantum indeterminacy might create space for consciousness to operate partially outside conventional physical constraints. The quantum world suggests reality is not fully determined until observed, Einstein noted. This raises profound questions about whether consciousness might exist in a state analogous to quantum superposition, not entirely localized in space and time, as we generally assume. This perspective led Einstein to speculate that consciousness might persist in quantum states not entirely bound by conventional space-time limitations. If consciousness interacts with matter at the quantum level, he proposed during a particularly intensive exchange with physicist David Bohm, then the dissolution of the physical brain at death might not necessarily entail the termination of the conscious entity that interfaced with it. Einstein emphasized that such continuity would not require supernatural intervention, but might follow naturally from quantum principles not yet fully understood. "Nature shows us only the tail of the lion," Einstein remarked, using one of his favorite metaphors. "But I do not doubt that the lion belongs to it, even though he cannot at once reveal himself because of his enormous size." Perhaps most intriguing was Einstein's speculation about quantum entanglement and consciousness. The quantum phenomenon of entanglement, which I once dismissed as spooky action at a distance, suggests connections that transcend spatial separation, Einstein acknowledged. If consciousness participates in quantum reality, it might similarly maintain coherence across what appear to be separate physical manifestations. This provided a potential scientific framework for understanding how consciousness might maintain continuity across different physical embodiments. A naturalistic approach to the concept of reincarnation that required no supernatural elements. Einstein was careful to distinguish his speculations from religious or mystical claims, insisting that any persistence of consciousness must operate according to natural laws, even if those laws transcend our current scientific understanding. "I am not interested in this phenomenon or that phenomenon," Einstein clarified when one participant suggested they were venturing into spiritualism. I want to know God's thoughts, the rest are details. And by God I mean the natural laws that govern the universe. This commitment to naturalism characterized Einstein's approach to consciousness, continuity seeking not supernatural explanations, but deeper physical principles that might accommodate the persistence of consciousness across different physical substrates. The classified transcripts reveal Einstein proposing experimental frameworks that might eventually test these speculations, suggesting quantum coherence measurements in biological systems and statistical analyses of purported memories of previous lives. Science advances through testable hypotheses, Einstein insisted. If consciousness continuity exists as a natural phenomenon, it must eventually yield to scientific investigation, even if our current methods are insufficient. This empirical commitment distinguished Einstein's approach from purely philosophical or religious treatments of reincarnation, grounding his speculations in the potential for future scientific verification rather than faith or tradition. The energy transformation model, Einstein's scientific framework for reincarnation. Albert Einstein's most revolutionary contribution to the classified Princeton dialogues was his application of energy conservation principles to consciousness. Persistence, drawing from his famous equation E=mc2, which established the equivalence of matter and energy, Einstein proposed a scientific framework for understanding how consciousness might transform rather than terminate at physical death. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed from one form to another, Einstein explained during a particularly intense session in March 1947. If consciousness represents a specialized organization of energy, as I believe it must, then its dissolution at death would only mean transformation into other forms, not its disappearance from the universe. This energy transformation model provided Einstein with a naturalistic framework for phenomena traditionally described as reincarnation. Unlike supernatural or religious conceptions that relied on an immaterial soul migrating between bodies, Einstein suggested that the informational patterns constituting individual consciousness might reassemble in new physical substrates according to natural laws we don't yet fully understand. The specific pattern that constitutes your unique consciousness, Einstein elaborated, could theoretically reorganize in another physical system, carrying forward certain essential characteristics while adapting to its new physical environment. Einstein drew parallels to how information can exist independently of any particular physical medium. Consider how the same symphony can be recorded on vinyl, magnetic tape, or digital media, he offered as an analogy. The physical substrate changes completely, yet the essential informational pattern, the music itself, remains recognizable. Consciousness may operate similarly, with the essential pattern persisting even as its physical implementation changes. This information-theoretic approach to consciousness was remarkably prescient, anticipating developments in computational theories of mind. By decades, the classified transcripts reveal Einstein's particular interest in the thermodynamics of consciousness. From a thermodynamic perspective, the highly ordered information state we experience as consciousness represents a local decrease in entropy, Einstein noted. The second law of thermodynamics doesn't prohibit such order from reforming elsewhere after the dissolution of its current physical structure, particularly if consciousness interacts with quantum fields in ways we don't yet comprehend. This thermodynamic approach provided a scientific language for discussing consciousness continuation without resorting to supernatural explanations. Einstein was careful to distinguish his energy transformation model from simplistic notions of personality or ego persistence. What might continue is not necessarily the psychological personality with all its peculiarities and memories, Einstein clarified when questioned by philosopher Martin Buber. Rather, it would be something more fundamental, the essential pattern or structure of consciousness that transcends specific memories or personality traits. This nuanced view aligned with certain Eastern philosophical traditions that distinguish between transient aspects of selfhood and more fundamental aspects of consciousness. The energy transformation framework also addressed the question of why most humans don't recall previous incarnations. Memory, as we understand it, is fundamentally tied to brain structure, Einstein explained. The transformation of consciousness energy into a new physical substrate would not necessarily carry forward specific memories, which are encoded in physical neural patterns. However, Einstein speculated that certain fundamental patterns might persist, explaining potential phenomena like children with unusual aptitudes or inexplicable phobias. The essential structure might carry forward, even if specific memories do not, he suggested. Throughout these discussions, Einstein maintained his commitment to scientific naturalism while exploring territory typically ceded to religious or mystical traditions. "I cannot accept any concept of God based on the fear of life or the fear of death," Einstein stated clearly. "But neither can I believe that the individual ego is extinguished in a final death. Strange as it may seem, I'm not an atheist. The problem involved is too vast for our limited minds." This position, neither embracing religious conceptions of an immortal soul nor accepting strict materialist views that consciousness simply terminates at death, characterized Einstein's unique contribution to understanding how consciousness might persist through natural processes of energy transformation, higher dimensional mathematics, and memory transfer. Albert Einstein's work with non-Euclidean geometry and four-dimensional space-time provided him with unique insights into how consciousness might operate across dimensions beyond our immediate perception. During the classified Princeton dialogues, Einstein developed this geometric perspective into a mathematical framework for understanding consciousness continuity and memory transfer between incarnations. "Our three-dimensional perception may be fundamentally limited," Einstein explained, while sketching complex geometric diagrams for the assembled thinkers. "Just as a two-dimensional being would have no concept of up or down, we may lack perceptual access to dimensions in which consciousness operates more fully." This higher dimensional approach offered Einstein a mathematical language for addressing one of the central puzzles in reincarnation concepts: why most humans don't recall past incarnations. Memory, as we typically understand it, is encoded in three-dimensional neural structures, Einstein elaborated, but consciousness itself may extend into dimensions beyond what our brains can fully access in our current evolutionary state. Using analogies from his work in relativity, Einstein suggested that memories of past incarnations might exist in higher dimensional structures that our three-dimensional brains cannot fully interpret, similar to how a two-dimensional being could not fully comprehend a three-dimensional object passing through its plane. "Consider a sphere passing through a two-dimensional plane," Einstein illustrated during one session, drawing diagrams that have only recently been declassified. To the two-dimensional beings living in that plane, the sphere would appear first as a point, then as a circle that grows and shrinks, and finally as a point again before disappearing. They would perceive different cross-sections of the same unified object as separate events in time. Similarly, Einstein proposed that what we experience as separate lifetimes might be cross-sections of a unified higher dimensional consciousness structure, with apparent separations being artifacts of our limited dimensional perception. The mathematical model Einstein developed suggested that while specific episodic memories might not transfer between incarnations, certain fundamental patterns or structures could persist across different physical embodiments. "The specific content of memory depends on brain structure," Einstein noted, but the essential geometric pattern of consciousness might maintain continuity in higher dimensions even as its three-dimensional manifestation changes. This could potentially explain phenomena like children with unusual aptitudes, inexplicable phobias, or rare cases of apparent past life memories, all representing partial access to higher dimensional information structures not entirely contained within the current physical brain. Einstein was particularly interested in the topology of consciousness, how certain essential patterns might maintain invariant properties across transformations, similar to how a coffee cup and a donut are topologically equivalent despite their different appearances. Topology teaches us that certain fundamental properties remain unchanged, even through dramatic transformations, Einstein explained. The consciousness structure that constitutes your essential nature might similarly maintain certain invariant properties across different physical manifestations, even while adapting to new environments and circumstances. This higher dimensional framework provided Einstein with a mathematical language for discussing concepts traditionally considered spiritual or mystical. Mathematics has a beauty and elegance that transcends cultural boundaries, Einstein observed. It provides a universal language that might eventually bridge the gap between scientific understanding and intuitions about consciousness that have persisted across diverse human cultures throughout history. Rather than dismissing traditional concepts of reincarnation as superstition, Einstein sought to identify potential scientific principles that might underlie such persistent human intuitions. Perhaps most intriguingly, Einstein suggested that as human understanding of higher dimensional mathematics advanced, we might develop technologies to access these typically hidden dimensions of consciousness. Our current inability to access these dimensions doesn't mean they don't exist or that we'll always be limited in this way, Einstein remarked. The evolution of consciousness itself might eventually allow greater access to these higher dimensions, revealing continuities that our current perception obscures. This evolutionary perspective characterized Einstein's optimism about humanity's potential to develop more comprehensive understandings of consciousness across multiple dimensions of reality. The universal field theory of consciousness, Einstein's final frontier. The culmination of Einstein's classified discussions on consciousness and reincarnation came in the form of what participants later called his universal field theory of consciousness, an ambitious attempt to integrate consciousness into his lifelong quest for a unified field theory. While Einstein never completed his unified field theory in conventional physics, these recently declassified transcripts reveal how he applied similar principles to understanding consciousness as a fundamental aspect of reality. If all forces ultimately derive from a single unified field, Einstein proposed during the final Princeton session, then consciousness itself might be understood as a specialized manifestation of this fundamental field rather than a product emerging solely from neural complexity. Einstein's approach explicitly challenged the prevailing scientific paradigm that treated consciousness as merely an emergent property of brain function. "We have been looking at the problem backward," Einstein explained, sketching equations that combined quantum field principles with his geometric approach to gravity. Rather than asking how matter produces consciousness, we should consider whether consciousness represents a fundamental field that interacts with matter in varying degrees of complexity and self-awareness. This perspective aligned with Einstein's philosophical monism, which resisted sharp distinctions between mind and matter, instead seeing them as different expressions of a more fundamental unified reality. The universal field theory of consciousness had profound implications for understanding reincarnation. Individual conscious experiences may represent localized expressions of a universal consciousness field, Einstein elaborated, temporarily individuated but fundamentally connected across space-time. This framework suggested that what we perceive as separate incarnations might be better understood as different temporal expressions of the same underlying consciousness field, much as electromagnetic waves represent different expressions of the same fundamental electromagnetic field. The apparent separateness of conscious entities is as much an illusion as the apparent separateness of electric and magnetic fields before Maxwell unified them, Einstein noted. This field-based approach provided a scientific framework for understanding how consciousness might maintain continuity while manifesting through different physical structures across time. The specific physical substrate, whether a human brain, another biological structure, or potentially even an advanced artificial system, would shape how the consciousness field expresses in that particular instance, Einstein explained. But the field itself would maintain underlying continuity across these various manifestations. This perspective offered a naturalistic understanding of reincarnation that required no supernatural elements, only a deeper understanding of consciousness. As a fundamental field interacting with physical reality, Einstein drew parallels between his field theory of consciousness and his work on unified field theory in physics. Just as the electromagnetic field produces distinct but related phenomena like light, radio waves, and electricity, Einstein suggested the consciousness field might manifest in various forms across different scales of complexity, from simple awareness in fundamental particles to the rich, self-reflective consciousness we experience as humans. This scalar perspective suggested consciousness might be universal, but expressed to different degrees throughout nature, an idea that resonated with certain panpsychist philosophical traditions while remaining grounded in field physics. The classified transcripts reveal Einstein's particular interest in how this consciousness field might interface with physical reality through quantum processes. Quantum fields already reveal a reality more fluid and interconnected than our classical intuitions suggest, Einstein noted. The consciousness field likely interacts with physical reality at this quantum level, potentially explaining phenomena that appear anomalous under classical physics. This quantum interface could potentially explain how consciousness might transfer between physical substrates, following established physical laws rather than requiring supernatural intervention. Einstein emphasized that his universal field theory of consciousness remained a scientific hypothesis rather than a completed theory. This framework represents the beginning of an inquiry, not its conclusion, he cautioned. The true test will come through rigorous mathematical development and eventually experimental verification. Nevertheless, Einstein expressed optimism that future scientific developments would validate key aspects of his approach. The history of physics shows that unification has repeatedly revealed deeper truths about reality, he reminded participants in the final session. The integration of consciousness into our fundamental physical understanding represents the next great frontier, perhaps the most significant one remaining. In his closing remarks of the classified dialogues, Einstein connected his universal field theory of consciousness to his lifelong scientific quest. My greatest satisfaction would not be in demonstrating that reincarnation exists as traditionally conceived, he clarified, but in showing that consciousness operates according to consistent principles that extend beyond our current scientific framework while remaining fully natural. The universe is not only stranger than we imagine, it is stranger than we can imagine, yet it remains, at its foundation, comprehensible through the language of mathematics and the methods of science.